The Navajo woman he was paid to rescue ended up saving his life instead. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the sand and rocks in shades of gold and red. The air was dry, and the wind carried a faint smell of sage and dust. Breath. In the distance, jagged cliffs rose like silent sentinels, watching over the barren land. Somewhere in this vast, empty stretch, danger waited, and a man named Samuel Reed was about to step right into it. Samuel was a tracker. He had spent most of his life moving through forests, deserts, and mountains, following the faintest footprints and reading signs that most people would miss. His eyes were sharp, his hands steady, and his mind always alert. He wasn't the kind of man to talk much, preferring silence and observation, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. That morning, Samuel had been hired for a difficult job. A local rancher had approached him the week before, explaining in quiet, anxious tones that a young Navajo woman named Lila had been taken by a gang. They had demanded ransom, and the woman's family could not pay. Samuel's task was simple in explanation but deadly in execution. Find Lila and bring her back safely. Pay. He had received his instructions carefully. The last person to try to rescue her had failed. Samuel studied the maps, listened to the locals, and noted every warning. The desert was not forgiving, and the gang was dangerous. Still, he was confident in his skills. He had faced storms, wild animals, and criminals before, and he trusted himself to navigate even the trickiest paths. By midday, Samuel set out from the small town on the edge of the desert, mounted on a strong brown horse named Dust. Dust had been with him for years, and the horse seemed to understand danger almost as well as Samuel did. As they moved through the dusty trails, Samuel observed every detail: the wind patterns, the shape of the sand dunes, and even the sounds of the birds in the sparse trees. He knew that any unusual silence or movement could be a sign of trouble. The locals had told him stories about the area where Lila was believed to be held. They spoke of narrow canyons where the sun barely reached the ground and shadows could hide anything. They warned of rattlesnakes, scorpions, and sudden sandstorms that could appear without notice. Samuel listened, nodding quietly. He did not fear the dangers. They were part of the job, but he respected them. Underestimating the land was a mistake no tracker ever made twice. As the day wore on, Samuel approached the first of several rocky ridges that would mark his journey. The ridges rose sharply from the desert floor, their surfaces cracked and weathered by years of sun and wind. He dismounted Dust carefully, letting the horse graze briefly while he examined the terrain ahead. Using a pair of binoculars, he scanned for any signs of movement. Broken branches, disturbed sand, or unusual tracks could indicate human activity or a trap. Hours passed, and the desert grew hotter. Samuel took only small sips of water, conserving his energy. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air shimmered with heat. He moved slowly, deliberately, leaving Dust to follow his tracks carefully. He noticed a narrow path leading into a small canyon.
The tracks here were fresh, barely a day old. Samuel's heart quickened.
This could be the first real clue. He followed the tracks, moving quietly and keeping his senses sharp. Every rustle of wind, every distant bird call seemed louder in the still desert. The canyon walls were high and close, forcing him to crouch and move carefully. Shadows shifted as the sun moved across the sky, and Samuel used them to his advantage, keeping to the cooler, hidden areas whenever possible. Suddenly, he saw something that made him pause. Footprints, small but deliberate, leading into a rocky crevice. He recognized them immediately. Not animal tracks. They belonged to a woman, but someone had tried to make them less obvious, covering them with sand and debris. Samuel smiled slightly. The effort meant she was clever, cautious, and aware of her surroundings. That would make her harder to find, but also stronger than expected. He pressed on, climbing over rocks and stepping lightly on loose gravel. The canyon narrowed even further, and the air grew cooler as sunlight struggled to reach the bottom. Samuel's eyes darted to every shadow. He knew from experience that danger could be anywhere, hidden just out of sight. The stories of bandits ambushing travelers in these very canyons were not exaggerations. He moved with careful precision, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. Not for attack, but for protection if necessary. By late afternoon, Samuel found signs that Lila had passed this way not long ago. Bent. A scrap of cloth caught on a thorn, faint impressions in soft sand, and a small pile of stones arranged in a pattern he recognized as a marker, a sign someone had been signaling a path. He followed them, knowing that whoever left them had either been very brave or very desperate. The desert began to take on a different character as the sun lowered in the sky. The rocks glowed orange, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. Samuel paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. Despite the danger, there was a quiet majesty here that few people ever saw. Bah. He thought of Lila, imagining her courage as she navigated this harsh landscape, and it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Night approached quickly in the desert, and Samuel knew he could not travel much further without a place to rest. He found a small overhang in the rocks and set up a temporary camp. Da stayed quietly nearby while Samuel inspected the supplies he had brought: water, food, rope, and a few basic medical items. He checked his maps again, plotting the next part of his route and considering every possibility. Before resting, Samuel sat silently, listening to the desert night. Crickets chirped, the wind whispered through the rocks, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. He thought about the woman he was trying to save. She had no idea help was coming, but she had survived this far on her own. That thought both reassured him and added pressure. He had to reach her before anything went wrong. As he finally lay down to rest, Samuel could not stop thinking about the days ahead. The desert would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The gang was dangerous, and the terrain was unforgiving. But Samuel had faced challenges before, and he had never failed when he trusted his instincts and stayed focused. Tomorrow, he would follow the tracks deeper into the canyon, closer to the place where Lila was hidden. And even though he did not yet know it, the journey would not go as he expected. The woman he had been hired to rescue was about to show a strength that would surprise him. In the silence of the desert night, Samuel could only prepare himself for the unknown, unaware that the real test was not just finding her, but surviving what lay ahead, together. The first light of dawn barely touched the edges of the canyon when Samuel stirred from his rest. The air was cooler than the previous day, carrying the faint scent of sage and dry earth. He rose slowly, careful not to disturb Dust, who had curled up near the rocks and was still dozing. The desert was waking quietly, with birds beginning to chirp and the soft rustle of wind brushing against the canyon walls. Samuel drank from his canteen, letting the cool water ease the dryness of his throat. Back. He packed his small camp efficiently, folding the blanket and securing his supplies. Every movement was practiced, precise, because he knew the smallest mistake could slow him down or attract unwanted attention. Dust nickered softly, sensing the urgency, and followed him as he led the horse deeper into the canyon. The tracks of the woman were easier to follow now that the morning light revealed details in the sand. But Samuel knelt frequently, examining footprints, broken twigs, and displaced stones. He noted the direction of each step and the weight behind it. Lila was traveling lightly but carefully, leaving hints for anyone who knew how to read them. Samuel respected that skill. Whoever she was, she had survived the desert so far with intelligence and awareness. As they moved, the canyon narrowed and became more treacherous. The walls were jagged, and loose stones threatened every step. Samuel had to lead Dust carefully, often dismounting to guide the horse over unstable terrain. Despite the difficulty, he felt a sense of anticipation. Every hour brought him closer to Lila, and every clue reminded him that she was alive and determined. Around mid-morning, Samuel came across the first real sign of human presence besides footprints. A small fire pit, long cold but recently used, sat at the edge of a rocky alcove. Smoke stains marked the stones, and a few charred sticks lay scattered nearby. He crouched low, inspecting the site. The gang had been here, or perhaps Lila herself had used it as a temporary rest stop. The careful arrangement suggested thought and caution, not chaos. Samuel's mind ran through possibilities. If the gang had passed this way recently, he would have to proceed even more carefully. But if Lila had made the stop, it meant she was smart enough to avoid direct confrontations.
Either way, the signs indicated movement in the right direction.
He let dust around the area quietly, careful not to disturb anything further. By late morning, the sun had climbed high into the sky, making the desert heat nearly unbearable. Best. Samuel slowed his pace, keeping dust in shaded spots where possible. He drank water regularly, mindful of exhaustion, but he never stopped observing. Shadows shifted, rocks glistened in unexpected ways, and even the sound of wind changed with the terrain. He knew that the desert was as alive as any person, and that ignoring its signals could be deadly. The canyon widened into a small valley surrounded by towering cliffs. Here, Samuel found more signs. Footprints leading toward a narrow stream, broken branches suggesting someone had tried to cross carefully, and the faint echo of distant voices carried on the wind. He paused, listening intently. The voices were soft, distant, and human. But he could not tell who they belonged to. Back. He motioned for dust to stay low, then crept forward, using rocks and bushes for cover. The sound grew clearer as Samuel approached. It was indeed human voices, speaking in hurried whispers. He could not yet see the speakers, but his instincts told him it was likely the gang. He crouched behind a rock, watching and listening, trying to determine numbers, positions, and their behavior. The desert had taught him that patience was more valuable than haste. Acting too quickly could ruin everything. After a tense moment, Samuel realized he needed a plan. The gang could be armed, and confronting them directly could be dangerous. He scanned the surrounding cliffs and noticed a narrow ledge running along the side.
It would be risky to traverse, but it offered a hidden path closer to the voices without being seen. Samuel made a quick decision.
He adjusted his gear, led dust carefully along a safer portion of the ledge, and began the slow, deliberate climb. Halfway along the ledge, Samuel spotted movement below.
A man was pacing near the stream, clearly on guard.
Samuel held his breath and waited for the guard to turn away before inching forward. The ledge was uneven, and dust shifted nervously beneath him. Samuel murmured softly, calming the horse and maintaining his own focus. Bay. Every step counted. Every mistake could be fatal. By early afternoon, Samuel had positioned himself in a small alcove above the area where the gang was gathered. From this vantage point, he could see 3 men, each alert but distracted. Breaths. They were armed, though not heavily. They spoke in low tones, occasionally glancing toward the desert beyond. Samuel studied their movements, noting their habits and weaknesses. He had trained for situations like this, but he also knew that unpredictability was part of every encounter. While observing, he noticed a glimpse of something that made his heart rate quicken, a shadow moving carefully along the edge of the stream. It was small, light-footed, and cautious. A woman. Samuel recognized immediately that this was Lila. She moved with care, staying hidden and using the terrain to her advantage. She was clever, avoiding the gang without confronting them directly. Samuel's admiration grew. Lila was not helpless. She had survived the desert, avoided dangerous men, and navigated terrain that would challenge even an experienced tracker. His mission was no longer simply to rescue her. It was to ensure that her cleverness and bravery did not put her in harm's way unnecessarily. Desk. He waited until the moment was right, then began descending carefully, staying out of sight. Dust followed, quiet and steady. Bang. Samuel's mind was focused entirely on the next steps. He had to get close enough to guide her away without alarming the gang. The desert and the cliffs offered cover, but it required patience and precision. The afternoon wore on, and the heat intensified. Bound. Samuel knew they could not move quickly in these conditions, especially with dust. He looked around for shaded paths and natural barriers that could help them remain unseen. Baked. The terrain was unforgiving, but it was also full of opportunities for someone who knew how to read it. Samuel's training became an advantage, but he reminded himself constantly that Lila's skill and intelligence might surpass even his expectations. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Samuel made his move. He crept closer to Lila, staying hidden behind rocks and sparse vegetation. Pay. When she paused to check her surroundings, he signaled softly, using subtle movements to guide her toward a safer path. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. Samuel realized she understood the signal and was willing to follow guidance from someone she did not yet know. Together they moved carefully, keeping a safe distance from the gang. Bah. Samuel kept one hand on his knife, not for attack, but for protection if necessary. Lila moved lightly, efficiently, but it was clear she had been traveling without food or rest. Bay. Samuel handed her some water and a small piece of bread. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, her eyes wary but trusting. By late afternoon, they had put several hundred meters between themselves and the gang. The shadows grew long, and the canyon walls turned a deep orange. Samuel found a small alcove with enough space to rest and allow dust to graze. He and Lila settled briefly, sharing a quiet moment. Samuel observed her carefully. She was young but remarkably resilient. Boss. Her eyes carried a mix of fear, determination, and intelligence. She had survived more than most people could imagine. As they rested, Samuel considered the journey ahead. The gang would likely discover her absence soon, and the desert offered no guarantees.
Every step forward required vigilance, careful planning, and trust in each other.
Samuel realized that this mission was not simply about following footprints. It was about partnership.
Lila's skill and awareness were as crucial as his own.
The first day of tracking had ended with success, but it had also revealed new challenges. The desert was beautiful, but it was also full of hidden dangers. The gang was unpredictable, the terrain unforgiving, and the hours of travel exhausting. Yet Samuel felt a growing respect for Lila, who had navigated these threats with skill and courage. He knew that the coming days would test both of them, and that survival depended not only on skill, but on their ability to work together. As night fell, they made a small camp in the alcove, keeping their presence hidden. Samuel watched the stars appear above the canyon, reflecting on the day. The desert was quiet now, but danger was never far away. He resolved to remain alert, to guide and protect, and to respect Lila's strengths along the way. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but Samuel was ready. Bess. He had found the woman he was hired to rescue, and he knew that she was more than capable of helping herself. And in that quiet desert night, both Samuel and Lila understood in their own ways that the journey ahead would demand courage, patience, and a careful balance between. The next morning, the desert was quiet, almost eerily so. The sun had not yet risen, and the canyon walls cast long shadows that stretched across the sand like dark fingers. Samuel rose before dawn, careful not to wake Dust, who stirred only slightly as he moved. Bah! He had learned long ago that the desert's calm could be deceptive. The first light of day often revealed dangers that had been hidden the night before. Samuel glanced at Lila, who was still asleep under a small overhang. Behave. She had rested lightly, but the strain of the previous day was clear in the tightness of her muscles and the alertness of her eyes. Samuel respected her resilience. Many people would have struggled to survive even a single day in the harsh desert, but Lila had not only survived, she had moved with intelligence and caution, avoiding danger at every turn. He quietly packed the small supplies they had left, distributing water and food evenly. Best, Lila stirred and opened her eyes, noticing Samuel's careful movements. "Good morning," she whispered, but Samuel nodded. They did not need many words. Their understanding was growing through gestures, eye contact, and shared focus. In the desert, communication often needed to be quiet, because sound could travel far and reveal their position. By first light, they were moving again. The canyon narrowed at points, forcing them to stay close to the walls. Samuel led, scanning for tracks, broken branches, and any signs of the gang. Lila followed, keeping low and moving lightly. Every so often she would pause and point to marks in the sand that Samuel had not noticed. A small animal's footprints, a faint scrape on a rock. These were details that could reveal more about the path ahead than any map. Samuel's admiration for her grew with every step. As the morning heat began to rise, Samuel spotted movement ahead. 3 men were walking along a ridge above the canyon floor. Base. Samuel froze, motioning for Lila to do the same. The men were armed with rifles and looked alert, scanning the terrain as they moved. Bear. Samuel counted them carefully, noting their formation and timing. They were clearly searching for something or someone. Lila's eyes widened slightly, but she did not panic. She pointed toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, just a few meters away. Bay. Samuel understood immediately. The crevice offered cover and a safer path around the ridge where the men were walking. "Follow me carefully," he whispered. Lila nodded and moved without hesitation, her trust in Samuel growing with each cautious step. Bow. The crevice was tight and jagged. Samuel led Dust first, guiding the horse carefully to avoid loose stones. Lila followed, moving with the same quiet precision she had shown the day before.
The men above were still scanning, unaware of the 2 hidden below.
Pay. Samuel felt a surge of relief. This part of the desert could have been deadly if they had been seen. After several tense minutes, they reached the other side of the ridge. The canyon opened slightly, offering a wider path. Samuel paused to catch his breath, scanning the surroundings for any signs of further danger. Lila did the same, her movements precise and alert. It was clear she was learning quickly, watching Samuel's methods and understanding how to avoid detection. They moved for several hours, the sun climbing higher and making the desert almost unbearable. Samuel kept track of their direction and pace, balancing speed with caution. He knew the gang would eventually notice that someone had passed through, and he wanted to stay ahead without exhausting Lila or Dust. He offered her small sips of water and bites of food, keeping her strength in mind. She accepted quietly, her focus never wavering. By mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow gorge where the terrain became especially difficult. Rocks jutted out at sharp angles, and loose gravel made every step precarious. Samuel led carefully, helping Lila navigate tricky sections. She followed his guidance but also pointed out paths he might have overlooked. The balance of trust and skill between them was growing. He realized that this partnership was not one-sided. Her knowledge and intuition were equally valuable. Psst, psst. Suddenly they heard voices from above. The gang was close, moving along a ridge that ran parallel to their path. Bet. Samuel froze, listening. The men were speaking quietly, but he could catch a few words. References to a woman, to a ransom, to traps. Samuel knew they were closing in on the very person he was trying to protect.
He motioned to Lila, signaling that they needed to move quickly but cautiously. They spotted a small overhang slightly ahead.
Pah. Samuel guided Lila and Dust toward it, using rocks and sparse vegetation for cover. From this position, they could observe the men without being seen. Samuel's mind raced, considering the next move. Direct confrontation would be dangerous. They needed to avoid it if possible. He whispered his plan to Lila, showing her how they could move quietly along a narrow ledge that would take them out of sight of the gang. She nodded, understanding without needing many words. Carefully, they began moving along the ledge. It was narrow, only wide enough for one person at a time, and a fall could be fatal. Bah. Samuel went first, steadying Dust as they balanced along the edge. Lila followed, moving lightly and precisely. The wind blew gently, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, and Samuel felt a mix of tension and relief. Each step was critical. One misstep could expose them to the men above. Halfway along the ledge, Dust stumbled slightly, sending small stones tumbling down the canyon. Samuel froze, heart racing. Lila immediately reacted, placing a hand lightly on Dust's shoulder to steady him. Samuel glanced at her, surprised by her quick reflexes and calm composure. "Thank you," he whispered softly. "Bah." She nodded, her expression focused and serious. They reached the end of the ledge without incident and descended carefully to the canyon floor. The gang was still unaware of their position. Samuel allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but he knew the danger was far from over. The desert was full of surprises, and the men could catch up at any moment. He glanced at Lila, noting her determination and resilience. But she had survived on her own so far, and now they were working together.
As they continued moving, Samuel and Lila shared small signs of understanding.
He pointed out landmarks, explained subtle signs in the terrain, and showed her how to use the natural environment for cover. She watched intently, asking few questions but demonstrating her ability to apply what she observed. But Samuel realized that their partnership was more than necessity. It was becoming a bond built on trust and mutual respect. By late afternoon, they reached a small stream where water trickled gently over smooth stones. Samuel allowed Dust to drink, and he handed Lila some water as well. She drank slowly, carefully conserving her strength. The desert sun was intense, but the stream offered a brief sense of relief. Samuel took this moment to assess their situation. They were still ahead of the gang, but not by much. They needed to find a safer path before nightfall. Pace. As they prepared to move on, Samuel noticed signs that the gang had passed near the stream recently. Footprints were fresh, and some of the sand had been disturbed. He gestured to Lila, signaling that they needed to proceed with extreme caution. She understood immediately and followed his lead, moving silently along a narrow path that hugged the canyon walls. Narration. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. The late afternoon shadows grew long, stretching across the canyon floor. Samuel felt the weight of exhaustion beginning to settle in, but he pushed it aside. Lila seemed equally weary, yet she continued moving with determination. Boo. He admired her strength and resilience. This woman whom he had been hired to rescue was proving to be more capable than he had expected. As the sun began to set, they found a small alcove that offered some shelter. Samuel made a quick assessment of the area, checking for dangers and potential hiding spots. He and Lila rested briefly, allowing Dust to graze and recover. Samuel handed her a small piece of food, and she accepted it with a quiet nod. They did not speak much. Words were unnecessary in the desert, but their understanding of each other was growing steadily. Night approached, and Samuel knew they would need to rest soon. He made a careful plan for their next move, considering the terrain, the gang's possible route, and the safest path forward. He glanced at Lila, recognizing her courage and skill. This mission was no longer just about finding her. It was about survival, teamwork, and trust. As darkness fell over the canyon, Samuel and Lila settled into the small alcove, keeping themselves hidden and protected. Perhaps. The stars appeared overhead, twinkling faintly in the clear desert sky. The desert was quiet, but the threat of the gang remained. Samuel felt a growing respect for Lila, who had faced danger with intelligence and bravery. He realized that the coming days would test both of them in ways they could not yet imagine. And in that quiet desert night, Samuel understood something important. This was no longer just a rescue mission. Lila had the strength, intelligence, and courage to protect herself and perhaps even save him when the time came. Desert morning arrived slowly, with a pale light spilling over the canyon walls. Samuel woke before sunrise, as was his habit, scanning the horizon carefully. Dust shifted nearby, ready for the day's journey. He turned to Lila, who was already awake and moving quietly, preparing herself with the same careful attention to detail he had noticed since the first day.
She was alert, aware, and focused, a far cry from the helpless person he had expected to find. The previous day's events had left Samuel with a growing respect for her.
Lila was clever, patient, and brave. He realized that her survival so far had depended on far more than luck.
She understood the desert in ways he did not, noticing details that would have escaped even his trained eyes. As he packed the remaining supplies, Samuel felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. He was no longer simply the rescuer. They were partners, each contributing their knowledge to ensure survival. By mid-morning, the heat had risen considerably. Samuel led Lila through a narrow canyon path that wound between steep rock faces. The gang was still searching, and he knew they would not give up easily. Every step required vigilance. Loose stones crunched underfoot, and the faint sound carried farther than one might expect. Samuel reminded himself to move slowly, to trust the terrain, and to trust Lila's instincts. She paused at times, scanning the walls and ground, pointing out faint scratches and unusual shadows. Samuel nodded each of them, impressed by her awareness. Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed from above. A rock dislodged on a ledge, clattering down the canyon wall. Psst. Samuel froze. Instinctively, he pressed Lila against the side of the rock, shielding her from view. Ahead, he spotted two of the gang members moving along a narrow ridge, clearly heading in their direction. The men were armed, cautious, but alert. Samuel realized that this encounter could become dangerous if they were discovered. He motioned for Lila to stay low. As they attempted to move quietly along a hidden path, the terrain shifted unexpectedly.
A loose rock gave way beneath Samuel's boot, sending him tumbling toward the edge of a small drop.
He caught himself with one hand, his heart pounding. Dust whinnied nervously, sensing danger. Psst. Samuel cursed softly under his breath. The desert had thrown him a trap he had not anticipated. Lila reacted instantly. Without hesitation, she grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him back to safety. He stared at her in surprise, realizing that she had saved him in that moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and admiration. Lila nodded, her eyes focused and calm. She did not speak, but the message was clear. She had the skill and courage to act decisively when it mattered most. Samuel felt a mix of humility and gratitude. The roles had shifted. He was no longer the sole protector, and he understood that survival depended on mutual trust. They continued moving carefully, Now even more aware of their surroundings, the gang was getting closer, and Samuel knew that confrontation might be inevitable. He adjusted his plan, using the natural cover of rocks and sparse vegetation to stay hidden. Lila followed his guidance but also contributed her own observations, pointing out weak points in the gang's path and suggesting safer routes. Their cooperation was seamless, built on trust, shared experience, and an understanding that each had strengths the other lacked. By afternoon, they reached a small ravine that offered temporary shelter. Samuel assessed the terrain, noting areas where the gang might approach and possible escape routes. He allowed Dust to drink from a shallow pool, while Lila rested briefly, conserving her strength. Samuel watched her closely, noting her resilience and intelligence. She had survived long enough to teach him an important lesson. Courage was not measured by physical strength alone, but by awareness, quick thinking, and determination. As they prepared to move on, Samuel noticed a faint shimmer in the sand ahead, a hidden trap left by the gang, perhaps to capture unwary travelers. He froze, recognizing the danger too late to stop. A metal wire was stretched across the path, nearly invisible in the sunlight. Dust's hooves brushed it, triggering a sudden snap. The wire was part of a trip mechanism connected to a small, unstable rock formation. Rocks began to shift precariously above them, threatening to tumble down the canyon wall. Samuel reacted quickly, trying to steady Dust and himself, but the rocks continued to fall. One struck Samuel's shoulder, knocking him off balance. Pain shot through his body as he stumbled backward, struggling to remain upright. Lila did not hesitate.
Breath. She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward a narrow overhang that offered some protection. With skill and determination, she guided both Samuel and Dust out of immediate danger, using her knowledge of the terrain to avoid the falling rocks.
Once they were safe, Samuel took a moment to catch his breath, his shoulder sore but intact. He looked at Lila with renewed respect. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. Lila shrugged slightly, as if it were only natural. Her focus was already on the path ahead, on keeping them both safe. Samuel realized that she was not just a survivor. She was a partner, someone whose courage could match his own. The incident with the trap had changed something between them. Samuel's confidence in his own abilities was tempered by an understanding of Lila's strengths. They moved forward with a shared sense of purpose, communicating with subtle gestures and quiet signals. The desert was still dangerous, but together they were stronger than they had been separately. By late afternoon, they reached a series of narrow ledges that required careful navigation. The canyon walls were steep, and a single misstep could be disastrous. Samuel went first, carefully guiding Dust along the ledge. Lila followed, moving lightly and deliberately. Her awareness of the terrain was impressive, and she pointed out spots where the footing was unstable. Samuel realized that without her, this part of the journey would have been far more dangerous. As they moved, the gang appeared again in the distance, moving along a ridge parallel to their path. Samuel crouched behind a rock, signaling for Lila to do the same. They watched as the men scanned the canyon floor, unaware of their position. Lila whispered a suggestion for a safer route, using a narrow path between rocks that Samuel had not considered. He nodded, trusting her judgment completely. Together, they moved silently along the path, staying out of sight and avoiding detection. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon. The desert was turning a deep orange, and the temperature was starting to drop. Samuel and Lila found a small alcove that offered shelter for the night. They allowed Dust to rest, and Samuel tended to his shoulder, which was bruised but not seriously injured. Lila inspected the area carefully, ensuring there were no hidden dangers nearby. Her vigilance and skill had saved him once that day, and Samuel knew it could happen again if they were not careful. As they settled in for the night, Samuel reflected on the events of the day. The desert was unforgiving, and danger could appear at any moment.
Yet he felt a growing respect and admiration for Lila. She had proven herself capable, courageous, and intelligent.
The woman he had been hired to rescue was not a passive victim. She was an active participant in her own survival, and in saving him, she had shown a strength that Samuel had never expected. The night was quiet, with only the faint rustle of wind and the distant howl of a coyote breaking the silence. Samuel and Lila rested, knowing that the next day would bring new challenges. Around. The desert would continue to test them, and the gang was still searching. But they had survived together, relying on skill, awareness, and mutual trust. In the darkness of the canyon, Samuel realized something profound. The mission was no longer just about rescuing Lila. It was about partnership, trust, and respect. She had saved his life, proving that courage and intelligence were as valuable as strength and experience. Samuel knew that the days ahead would continue to challenge them, but he also knew that they were stronger together than apart. And so, under the stars and in the quiet of the desert night, Samuel and Lila rested, each aware that the journey was far from over, yet feeling a deep sense of mutual respect and trust. The roles had shifted, but the mission remained. Survival, guidance, and above all, working together to overcome the dangers that lay ahead.
The morning light stretched across the desert like soft gold, painting the rocks and sand in warm hues.
Samuel rose quietly, careful not to wake Dust or disturb Lila, who had slept lightly under the small overhang. The events of the past days had left them both exhausted, yet alert. The desert was alive with small sounds, the rustle of wind through sagebrush, the distant call of a hawk, and the faint movement of lizards across sun-warmed rocks. Every sound reminded Samuel that the desert demanded attention. But it also carried a strange sense of peace. Lila stirred, sitting up and stretching. Her eyes met Samuel's, and they shared a small nod of acknowledgement. No words were necessary. Over the past days, they had developed a silent understanding, a rhythm that allowed them to move through the desert safely and carefully. Samuel had learned to trust her instincts as much as his own, and she had learned to follow his guidance when it mattered most. Together, they had survived where many others would have failed. After a quick breakfast of dry bread and water, they prepared to continue. Samuel checked the path ahead, studying the canyon walls and noting potential dangers. Lila helped Dust adjust his saddle, her hands steady and precise. Samuel was struck once again by how capable she had become. She had been clever, brave, and resourceful from the beginning, and now she moved with confidence that came from experience and necessity. As they moved, the desert seemed to open up before them. The canyon widened into a gentler valley, dotted with scrub and small trees. Birds called from the branches, and a faint breeze cooled the air slightly. Samuel allowed himself a small moment of relief. The danger of the gang still lingered somewhere behind them, but the immediate threats were fading. They were moving toward safety, toward the edge of the desert and closer to Lila's home. Around midday, Samuel paused to study the terrain. He noticed subtle signs that the gang had abandoned the search for the moment. Broken branches and faint tracks indicated they had retraced their steps in frustration. Samuel allowed himself a quiet smile. But Lila had survived their encounter, avoided direct conflict, and kept them both out of danger.
He realized that her intelligence and courage had been as crucial to their survival as his own skills.
They continued along a narrow trail that wound through gentle hills and patches of desert flowers. Samuel noticed how carefully Lila observed every detail, the direction of the wind, the softness of the sand, and even the movement of distant birds. Her awareness reminded him that survival depended not just on strength, but on observation, patience, and quick thinking. Samuel had been hired to rescue her, but now he understood that her guidance had saved him as much as he had guided her. By late afternoon, the trail led them to a small river that glimmered in the sunlight. Water sparkled across smooth stones, and the air was cooler and more refreshing. Samuel allowed Dust to drink, while Lila knelt at the edge of the river, cupping water in her hands to drink and refresh herself. The exhaustion of the past days was visible in her features, but there was also a sense of calm determination. She had survived the desert, evaded danger, and reached this point through skill and courage. As they rested, Samuel reflected on the journey. The mission had been dangerous from the start, filled with risks, traps, and uncertainty. Yet through it all, Lila had proven herself as much a survivor as anyone he had known. She had saved him, guided him, and shown courage that went beyond mere physical strength. Samuel realized that heroism was not about being alone in danger. It was about trust, teamwork, and recognizing the strengths of others. After a short rest, they began the final stretch toward Lila's home. The landscape became gentler, with more signs of life. Small animals scurried through the brush, and distant smoke rose from chimneys in a small cluster of buildings. Samuel's eyes softened as he realized that the journey was nearly over. The desert had tested them both, and they had endured, learning lessons about trust, courage, and resilience along the way. As they approached the settlement, Lila's steps became quicker, her eyes bright with recognition and relief. Samuel stayed slightly behind, giving her space to reunite with her family safely. When she reached the small group waiting near the edge of the village, her parents rushed forward with tears in their eyes. They embraced her tightly, expressing gratitude and relief. Samuel watched silently, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mission he had been hired to complete was successful, but the true success had been their partnership and survival together. Lila turned to Samuel, her eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Samuel shook his head gently.
"No, I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. There was a shared understanding in their eyes.
They had saved each other in ways neither could have predicted. The desert had tested them both, and through those trials they had learned the value of trust, courage, and partnership. After the reunion, Samuel spent a few quiet moments with Dust, preparing the horse for the journey back. He watched Lila and her family from a distance, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The desert had been harsh, unforgiving, and full of dangers, but it had also revealed something important: the strength of the human spirit and the power of mutual respect and trust. Samuel knew he would carry these lessons with him for the rest of his life. As evening fell, Samuel mounted Dust and began the journey back across the desert. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The canyon walls cast long shadows, and the wind carried a cooler breeze. Samuel moved steadily, reflecting on the events of the past days. Lila had not been a passive person in need of rescue. She had been an active participant in her survival, saving him as much as he had guided her. The mission had changed him, teaching him humility and respect for the courage and intelligence of others. The journey home was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of the desert. Samuel thought about the moments when danger had seemed overwhelming, the times when quick thinking had saved them, and the silent understanding that had developed between him and Lila. Each step reminded him that survival was never a solitary endeavor. It was about awareness, courage, and the willingness to trust someone else. As night fell completely, Samuel camped under a small overhang for the night. Dust grazed nearby, and the stars filled the sky in brilliant patterns. Samuel reflected once more on the journey. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and reminded him of the fragility and resilience of life. But it had also given him a profound lesson. True courage is often shared, And sometimes, the person you set out to save may end up saving you. By the next morning, Samuel continued his journey home, the desert stretching endlessly around him. He moved with a quiet confidence, knowing that the lessons he had learned would remain with him forever.
Lila's courage, intelligence, and determination had left a lasting impression.
The mission had been completed, but the experience had changed him in ways far beyond the payment he had received. When he finally reached the edge of the desert, Samuel paused to look back. The canyon walls rose majestically, the path they had traveled winding like a ribbon through the sand. The memory of danger, cooperation, and survival lingered in his mind. He knew that Lila would continue her life with strength and resilience, and he would continue his with a deeper understanding of trust, partnership, and the unexpected ways courage could manifest. As Samuel rode into the distant hills, the desert behind him, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The mission was over, the danger had passed, and the bond formed in the harshest of conditions would remain. He realized that some of the most important lessons in life came not from success or reward, but from the people who challenge us, protect us, and teach us the true meaning of courage. And so, the journey ended, not just in the safe return of Lila, but in the growth of understanding, respect, and a quiet gratitude that only those who face life's true tests can know.
Samuel would remember her bravery, her intelligence, and the moment when roles reversed and the one he had been hired to save had saved him instead.
The desert had been harsh, unforgiving, and full of lessons, but above all, it had revealed the strength that lies in human courage, trust, and partnership.